They were studying chimpanzees and they were figuring out what is the role of older chimpanzees in chimpanzee societies. So one day they were following a chimpanzee called Chausiku. She was lethargic. She kind of ignored her infant. She started building a nest in the middle of the day to take a rest. And then she goes to a particular shrub and starts pulling off the branches and then starts stripping off the bark of the branches and sucking the inner pith of the branches. And the next day they found her again and she recovered after 24 hours, which is the same amount of time that the traditional healers know that the plant works. Then they followed this up with a whole series of experiments to show the chimpanzees often get infected with intestinal worms, that these plants have toxins that can kill these worms, that the chimpanzees suck enough of the stuff to get the right dose to kill the worms, that they do it during the wet season when there are a lot of worms.
But not enough to kill them, which is pretty amazing too, with dosing of those chimpanzees.
Yeah.
Welcome back to the Bioactive Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Riley Kerg, and I have an awesome subject and guest today that we've actually never talked about, but it's one of my kind of special interests. So I have Dr. Jaap De Roode, who is a researcher of Zoo Pharmacognosy. And if anybody's been listening, you know my background's in pharmacognosy or understanding natural products, but this is a whole different realm of pharmacognosy that has to do with animals medicating themselves. So welcome to the show, Dr. DeRoode. And I can't wait to hear more about your history and your background, but would you mind starting with what you're currently researching or doing in this realm of zoo pharmacognosy?
Yeah, so my research really focuses on infectious diseases and parasites, and I mostly study those in monarch butterflies and honeybees. And for monarch butterflies, we're really trying to figure out how the monarchs can use toxic compounds that occur in the milkweeds that they use as caterpillars, how they affect their infectious disease, how they can use them as medicine. And in the honeybees, we're currently investigating if honeybees can use fungi, basically collect mycelium and mushrooms to take care of all sorts of infections in their colonies.
Oh, so cool. I want to circle back to that after we kind of finish doing overview information, but I'm sure you're familiar with Dr. Anurag Agrawal, who studies monarchs and milkweeds. Yep. He was on this show recently, so it's so cool that your current research is involving milkweeds, because the listeners are already familiar with kind of the relationship between milkweeds and the toxic compounds that they produce. So that's awesome. And can we talk more about zoo pharmacognosy in general? What got you interested in studying how animals medicate? Because this is a very niche topic that I think people don't even realize is being studied with these different types of animals, whether it's your dog, like the one on your lap, or whether it's a bear, or whether it's a dolphin. I don't know, all these different animals. What got you interested in this topic?
Kind of really accidental. I started studying monarch butterflies back in 2005 because I was really interested in understanding their parasites. And, you know, we take it for granted that we get sick, we get infectious diseases, and our pets do. You take them to the vet. But a lot of us don't really realize that wild animals also have all sorts of parasites and pathogens that cause all sorts of disease in them. And so I was really interested in that. And that's actually what brought me to monarch butterflies, because they have a very common disease. It's caused by a protozoan parasite. So a little bit like the parasites that cause malaria in humans. And it infects, you know, in North America, between 1 and 10% of all the monarchs. So it's really quite common disease. And I was really interested in just studying the parasite and, you know, what kind of damage does it do to the host, and what is it doing, how is it spreading. But then I quickly really started being interested in understanding if different milkweeds that the monarchs use as larval food, if they could act as medicine. And this really kind of comes from the idea, you know, you mentioned Anurag Agrawal. And of course, a lot of people have looked at milkweeds and monarch butterflies where they use the milkweeds, the toxic milkweeds, as protection against predators. So the story is always, right, that they take the chemicals, they're tolerant of them, they put them in their own tissues, and then they advertise that to their predators, such as birds, who then don't eat the monarchs. But I was very biased towards infectious disease because that's my training and that's what I'm interested in. So then I really became interested in asking these same chemicals, do they also work against this infectious disease, against this parasites? And that's how I got to it in the first place, because as soon as I found that these chemicals that are called cardenolides, that they can also reduce infection with the parasites. The next question then for me was, well, can the monarchs take advantage of that and actually actively use them as medicine?
And can they?
Yes. Yes, they can. And so this is really exciting because it was actually quite remarkable how strong the effects were of the different milkweeds on the parasites of
So
the
different
monarch.
species of milkweeds or just individual plants and how the load of cardenolides?
Yeah, I mean, it can be both, but we looked at different species because some species are just predictably have much higher concentrations of those toxins, these cardenolides, than others. And so we found that some of these species can really reduce infection, can reduce the growth of the parasites, can reduce the disease symptoms of the parasite. And so, and it was actually funny because the first time we published those results in the discussion of the scientific publication, speculated that maybe monarchs could use this. And one of the reviewers said, there is just no way.
Was it reviewer 2? Because it's always reviewer 2.
It's often actually reviewer 3 as well. But I think it was reviewer 2. But either way, we had to remove it from the paper. And because the idea was, well, there's no way that monarchs are smart enough to do this. And so then the next series of experiments was really to test if they could. And so we did experiments with caterpillars. And sick caterpillars have no preference at all for medicinal milkweed. But that kind of makes sense because it's not the caterpillars in monarchs that make choices. It's really the mothers that do, because it's the mothers that place the eggs on specific milkweeds.
Interesting, yeah.
Right? Because say a monarch lays an egg on an oak tree or on a piece of lettuce, then the caterpillar is going to die. They cannot eat that. So it has to be milkweed, but then the monarchs can choose different milkweed. So then the second series of experiments is really to ask, well, if the mothers, if they are infected, and what is happening actually when they are infected, they carry millions of parasite spores on their abdomens. And when they lay eggs, they transfer those accidentally. They cannot stop that. But then the question is, can they lay their eggs on more medicinal milkweed so that when the caterpillars come out of their eggs, they get the parasites, but do they then also get the medicine? And that turns out to be the case. So it's the mothers that are infected, that are sick, that prefer to lay their eggs on the medicinal milkweeds, so that the caterpillars, when they come out of their eggs, they get the medicine, and therefore they're less likely to become sick.
And is that kind of a balancing act between, like, there's so many cardenolides that it could kill the little caterpillars versus being medicinal and being able to help with this parasite load?
Yeah, and that's actually exactly how we define, in some ways, medicines. It's actually really hard to define what medicines are and what medicine is. But when we look at the use of medicines or drugs, and I kind of use those interchangeably, in animals and humans, one thing they have in common is that there's always side effects, right? If we use medicines at the wrong dose, it can kill us. There's all sorts of side effects. That's the whole leaflet, right? When we buy a box of pills, comes with this whole leaflet explaining all the terrible things that will happen to you if you use it. And that's the same for animals. So yeah, if the monarchs use milkweed that's too toxic, it can kill the parasites, but it can also kill them. So it is indeed a balancing act.
Interesting. I really liked the part of your book, Doctors by Nature, where you're talking about how much back and forth was really between researchers and scientists when trying to think of a description of zoo pharmacognosy. Because as you're just saying, it's like if a bug is always eating the same plant, then that plant isn't the medicine. It would have to kind of do something different to show that it's medicating.
Yeah.
But there's also a lot of discourse about just using the words like self-medicating and what that implies.
Yes.
Do you mind kind of diving into that a little bit of like how our language is developed around this topic of animals medicating and what goes into that conversation?
It's in some ways, it's all very difficult to define. And that's partly because everything is kind of a gray area. What is food? What is medicine? It really comes down to the dose, right? And even when we think about coffee, caffeine, so we can drink that and it's nice and makes us alert. But if you have too much or you inject it directly into your bloodstream, it can kill you, right? So there's food, poison, medicine. It all comes down to the dose in some ways. But yeah, people use different terminology to really think about how animals use medicine. And so I personally, so what I have started to call is animal medication. I don't call it animal self-medication. And the reason for that is that oftentimes animals don't medicate themselves, but others. So the monarch butterflies we just discussed, it's the mothers treating their future offspring, right? So it's not really self-medication. And we see that with a lot of different animals. Personally, I don't use the Zoo Pharmacognosy either. And the reason for that is that I have often found that cognosy part would suggest to people that, it really requires this kind of brain function and really thinking about what you're doing.
Like intentional medicating.
Yeah. Well, I think intentional is a part of it, but a lot of animals are not actually aware of what they're doing. And it's really their bodies telling them, so their guts telling them to use the medicine, so they may not even be aware of it, right? And so that's why I personally use animal medication, but nothing is ideal, nothing is perfect. But at the end of the day, what matters is that animals change their behavior. They start using something that they don't make themselves, right? So it's not like they use their own immune cells or something like that, or their own saliva. It's really about using something from the environment, whether that's a plant, whether that's clay, whether that's an animal or a fungus, and using that. And then it has to help them in reducing disease. And, and again, the question, so I focus very much on infectious disease. My whole book is about that because that's where we have the most science at the moment. And so then really the question is, well, they change their behavior, they're doing something, does it help them? And it's really important because there's a lot of really cool parasites out there that change the behavior of the host that they infect for their own benefit. So you have to be really careful when you look at changes in behavior.
Is this like the cordyceps mushroom that kind of turns the bugs into zombies? Would that be an example of this?
Absolutely. Yes.
Okay,
well,
cool.
And in fact, there is just a book that came out, Rise of the Zombie Fungus.
Yeah.
And so it's all about that, right? And so that's a really good example. So Ophiocordyceps is a fungus, infects a lot of different insects. It's well studied in ants and what it does. It infects the ants, and then it makes the ants walk away from the nest and then go and climb up a stick or a tree, make it bite the underside of a leaf. So it sits upside down, and then the fungus grows a mushroom essentially out of the body, starts sprinkling the spores to infect other ants, right? So it's a change in behavior that's helping the fungus, not the ant.
Yeah, and it's super freaky looking. If you are watching on YouTube, I'll put a picture on the screen because it's just absolutely wild. I remember when I first started learning about that. Just to give the listeners a little more context, I really appreciate the example of monarchs and milkweed toxins. Can we give a couple more examples in nature of ways that we've seen animals medicating in some way?
Absolutely. There are so many examples. I'll start with one to get back to my point about animals don't need to know what they're doing.
Yeah.
And that comes from another type of caterpillar. That's the woolly bear caterpillar. A lot of people would call them fuzzy wuzzies.
Yeah.
And these caterpillars are kind of different from monarch caterpillars. They can eat a lot of different foods. So they're not tied to just one genus of plant or very, closely related plants. They can eat a lot of different plants. And these guys get attacked by, you mentioned freaky. So a lot of parasites are freaky, and I love it. I don't want to get them myself, but I really appreciate parasites from their own point of view. Right? They're struggling in life just like the rest of us.
They're very successful for how small they are. It's amazing.
But everyone wants to kill them. So, it's not great being a parasite in some ways. But anyway, these woolly bear caterpillars get these parasitoid flies, and what they do is they lay eggs on the caterpillar, and the maggots come out of the eggs. And they eat their way into the caterpillar, and then they start eating it up from the inside out. And then when the maggots are big enough to become an adult fly, they eat their way out of the caterpillar to pupate, and then they turn into the adult fly. And then they burst out of that body like the alien in the movie and kill the caterpillar.
Absolutely gnarly.
Yeah, it's not good news for the caterpillar. But you think of the maggots as cute baby flies, then it's a different story. Regardless, these caterpillars, when they eat specific alkaloids, so a different type of chemical, it can actually kill those flies. And what is really intriguing, and scientists have shown this with some very steady hands, it turns out that these caterpillars have 4 different taste receptors, and one of them specifically tastes these medicinal alkaloids. And what they then did is they put tiny little electrodes in individual taste buds in the mouths of these caterpillars. And they had infected with flies or uninfected caterpillars. And then they would give them these alkaloids and measure the firing rates of the nerve cells that connect these taste buds to the brains. And they see that for the infected caterpillars, those nerve cells just start firing like crazy. And so what that really means is that when the caterpillars are infected, these alkaloids just taste really good, right? And so then they start eating more of it, and that kills the flies. And now the caterpillar has cured itself, essentially. But I love that example for many reasons. But one of them is that it shows that the caterpillar doesn't need to know what it's doing, right? It's basically the body responding to this infection.
Just the brain firing, saying, yep, great, keep going, keep going. Yeah,
the caterpillar doesn't need to know it's infected. It doesn't need to know it's eating alkaloids. It doesn't need to know that those alkaloids are medicinal. And so it's really the body of the caterpillar telling, eat more of this, and that's going to help, right? And so, and I think that's great, because that shows, we're talking about caterpillars so far, right? And so that already shows you don't have to have brains like ours or chimpanzees, for example, to do all of this. It's really the bodies that can respond to these things.
Are there any examples of something like a chimp or a bear or something that's larger, maybe taking a slightly different approach to medicating?
Yeah, absolutely. And that was really the first scientific evidence for animals using medicine came from chimpanzees. This was in the 1980s. And, what's interesting is that in Western society, in Western science, we're always looking for ways for humans to be unique and different and better than other animals. And so for a long time, people say, medicine is one of those things that really makes us human. Only humans use medicine. And it was not until the 1980s that scientists showed that wasn't the case. And it's actually quite important to realize who discovered it in chimpanzees, because it was a team. And one of the team members was Mike Hoffman, who was a primatologist who did all his training in Japan. And that's relevant because in Japan, they have a very different cultural and religious heritage than in Western society. So with their Shinto and Buddhism religion, they never viewed humans as different. They always viewed humans as, being square in nature, part of nature. And that made them more open-minded about the abilities of animals to doing things. And Mike Hoffman was working with a park ranger in Tanzania called Mohammedi. And Mohammedi was also a traditional healer in his local community. And he came from a long line of healers. So his grandfather and father, they were all traditional healers. And so that also, of course, made him very open-minded. And in fact, in those societies, they had looked at animals to gain knowledge about medicine.
Oh, but like what plants they were eating to help them? Yeah. Amazing. Yeah.
And so they were studying chimpanzees for a completely different reason. They were figuring out what is the role of older chimpanzees in chimpanzee societies. And so one day they were following a chimpanzee called Chausiku. It's another, the primatology in Japan gave their primates names rather than numbers.
Not just like monkey 4.
Exactly.
Oh, I love that.
And so that already assigned a certain personality to them. And so they were following Chausiku. Chausiku behaved differently. She wasn't, moving as fast. She was lethargic. She kind of ignored her infant. She started building a nest in the middle of the day to take a rest. All of these things that they don't do normally. And then she goes to a particular shrub and starts pulling off the branches, and then starts stripping off the bark of the branches and sucking the inner pith of the branches. And this is a plant they'd never seen or used before. But Mohammedi noticed this plant, and he tells Huffman, this is called mujonso, and it translates as bitter leaf. And this is a plant we use for infections when, we treat humans. And so that was the first indication, to Huffman. So, maybe Chausiku is using this as medicine. And the next day they found her again, and she recovered after 24 hours, which is the same amount of time that the traditional healers know that the plant works. And first, that doesn't prove much yet, but then they followed this up with a whole series of experiments to show that the chimpanzees often get infected with intestinal worms, that these plants have toxins that can kill these worms, that the chimpanzees suck enough of the stuff to get the right dose to kill the worms, that they do it during the wet season when there are a
But
lot
not
of worms.
enough to kill them, which is pretty amazing too, a dosing of those chimpanzees.
Yeah, but if they eat too much of it, it kills them. So it again goes to this balancing act of cost and benefits. So that was really the first time that science, described this medication in animals. And even then, even though the chimpanzees are very closely related to humans, even then there were a lot of scientists that said there's just no way. They're just not smart enough. They can't do this. And so even that was controversial. It required a lot of studies to really persuade people.
Wow. No. Do we know, and you mentioned that these researchers in Japan were studying the communities. Do we know if any of that plant knowledge is kind of shared within chimp communities and then shared? So I don't know, mother chimp can teach baby chimp that this plant is good for whatever it is.
Yeah. So Chosiku's infant was actually really interested when she was using this plant and started tasting some of it. Right, and that's important because then he would have realized, oh, this is really bitter. And then he can remember that, because oftentimes bitterness is an indication for medicinal value. Even in our expression, using a bitter pill, comes from this idea that a lot of medicinal substances taste bitter. But there's another really good example in chimpanzees that was occurring around the same time. And this is called leaf swallowing. And this actually goes back to the 1960s when Jane Goodall had already described that sometimes when you look at the feces of chimpanzees, you find undigested leaves in them, complete whole leaves. And so what chimpanzees often do is they find leaves and then they fold them over, put them in their mouth, swallow them, and without eating them. And people wondered, why is this? Well, it turns out, again, with Huffman and a lot of colleagues studying this, that the chimps use a lot of different leaves, but they have in common, they're very rough. They're like Velcro. That's how they feel. And then what the chimpanzees, they fold them, they swallow them, and basically pulls the parasites out of the guts of the chimpanzees. And
so it's like a physical way of combing out the parasites. Wow.
But as you can imagine, swallowing a whole leaf is not fun. So they fold it up so that it gets smaller, and then there's swallow it. And there's many different ways you can fold a leaf. And different groups of chimpanzees use different folding mechanisms. So what that means is you get one chimpanzee that comes up with a method and the other chimpanzees copy it. So there's definitely a lot of copying of, group members that can be mothers to offspring, but it can also be younger to older chimpanzees. Basically, they're apes. They like to ape each other. And so in this case, they can learn from each other how to use medicine.
Wow, that is fascinating. That's so cool that it's a completely different mechanism too of physically removing versus chemically removing.
Yeah. And originally people thought that it was a chemical thing, and they actually described a particular chemical, but then discovered there's just not enough of it to do it. And then they found that when you look at the feces, you often see in those hairs, those rough hairs on the leaves, you see the parasites stuck to it. And the other thing that those really rough leaves do is they kind of irritate the gut so that they have diarrhea and they purge the parasites.
Oh, so fascinating. So with these, I'll just say smarter animals, I guess that's how I'll classify them, higher up animals. I don't know how the correct term there, but with these types of animals.
I don't think there is a correct one.
Okay. I'm going to use smarter then. I feel like that's simple. Okay. With these smarter type of animals, you mentioned with the caterpillars that their brain just firing, saying, yep, keep going. But you mentioned, with chimps and stuff, it could be, translated within their community, or it could be taste receptors. I don't know if you're familiar. I didn't read this in the book, but are you familiar with Dr. Ben Killam in New Hampshire or the New England area? He studies bears and how bears use wild plants to medicate. And he actually...
So I do remember that now. Yeah.
Yeah,
right.
So he discovered a organ in bears that's on the top part of their palate in their mouth. And he's finding that when bears, they can kind of go up to plants and mouth them a little bit, and that this organ responds in ways that can tell the brain this is, I don't know exactly the path here, but saying this is positive for what you need right now. This is toxic. Don't eat that, based on how the mouth and this unique organ responds, which I think is just absolutely fascinating in the medicating world, because this organ was just discovered, and what other animals might have something like that to help their brain understand medicating a little better? I guess it's not really a question. It's more of like a, whoa, I think this is so cool.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a lot of undiscovered mechanisms. I will say that the other very common way for animals to develop their medication is through associative individual learning. And so there have been a lot of experiments on sheep and goats. So in the livestock industry, so a lot of research from Utah State University really shown that, say, a goat has got parasites and you offer it different foods. And then when it eats a food, a particular plant, in this case, it comes down to tannins, a different kind of chemical again, that gets rid of those parasites. And now they make the association between those tannins and relief of the symptoms. And the next time they are sick, they're going straight to those plants that have those. And so that individual learning is really important as well. And I think that is, and we now know a lot of animals can learn. It's not just the smarter ones, if you want to use that term. But recently, there was a paper several months ago in Current Biology showing that jellyfish can learn as well through association. So they can learn to avoid obstacles even in an aquarium and stuff like that. So this individual learning is very common. And so I think that's another way, a lot of animals, they can make those associations between eating something, feeling better. And again, they don't have to know what they're doing, right? So they know that I eat this, I feel better, but they don't have to know that I'm infected. I eat this, that gets rid of the parasites. Now I feel better, right? It's pretty much simpler than that.
Yeah. And I love that you just brought up the example of livestock, because that is a component of the book talking about livestock medicating and how our current infrastructure of like big agriculture doesn't always allow for animals medicating in ways that might be helpful to them. Would you mind kind of touching on this and ways that, even theoretically, we might be able to improve agricultural practices to allow animals to have more resources to do what their instincts tell them to do when they're sick?
Absolutely. And this is another interesting thing is that in the domestication process, the idea has often been we have really dumbed down our animals, right? Made them really stupid, because in the wild, these animals are really good at surviving. And of course, we're selecting for specific traits. And it's definitely true. If the little dogs that are in my lap, if you let them out on their own, they probably won't make it very far. Same for sheep and goats. But it doesn't mean they have lost all their abilities to make the right diet choices. And so this same research from Utah State has really shown that these animals still have the ability, not just to make these associations between using particular foods and getting better, but also in really making up the diet that gives them what they need. And they have done some really elegant experiments. One of them I found truly fascinating is an experiment with cattle. And they had calves that they gave one, food, basically the mixed ration that has everything in it. And then another group that had the four ingredients that went into it, so that the cows could choose how much they ate of each ingredient. Now, it turned out that every calf in the study used a different diet. So there's a lot of individual choices. No one eats exactly the same. And we know that as humans, right? No one eats exactly the same if you have the choice. But the really stunning thing was that on average, they ate 20% less than if they were given the mixed ration. And the reason for that is that when you have these mixed foods, the animals keep on eating until they have enough of what limits them the most. So they're overeating other things. But when they have the choices, they can balance their diet better. So 20% less food, that's 20% less resources, and it's 20% less greenhouse emissions from this livestock. And so I think that's just utterly amazing. And despite the domestication, they still have it.
Yeah, that's amazing. And I guess, taking the human nature aspect of that, same thing. If you were given just like a slop of food, you might just keep eating until you were like, okay, I'm full. I have enough vegetables. I have enough whatever. But if you had those separated nicely on a plate, maybe you don't need as much food. So that's really interesting.
And there's analogies, because some scientists have said, that's exactly what's happening, say, with fast food. It's so rich in salt and fat, but it's very limiting in the protein we need. So you keep on eating until you have enough protein, but that means you eat way too much fat, way too much sugar, and way too much salt, right? And so there's even some ideas that, you can consider it as fast food, almost like that mixed ration. And, we're forcing people to overeat because we're not giving them enough of what they actually need.
Wow. And is this also like if you were to give animals space to graze on like different types of plants, do we see similar trends
Yeah.
where maybe animals will typically eat the same diet, but once they're not feeling well, instead of
Yeah.
just injecting them with stuff to make them feel better, we can actually give them plants that they would just naturally eat to
That's
help
right.
resolve
Yeah.
that?
Yeah. So the ideal, right, for the livestock industry, and that's what the researchers at Utah State have said, is that, have them in paddocks where they have a more natural environment. And it's not just one type of grass, but really provide them with a lot of different plants that they can choose from. And it's not just to cure themselves when they get sick, but also preventative care is important. So provide them with a lot of plants that have antioxidants and really kind of prevent disease in the first place. A lot of these things come back to choice. It all comes down to choice and diversity. Having enough things to choose from is the best way to keep animals healthy, whether they're wild animals, whether they're our pets, whether they're our livestock. Without choices, you've got nothing to choose, right? And so, but given the choices, animals can really develop these ways to prevent diseases, but also to make them better once they are sick.
Yeah, choices always make us more resilient. Diversity is always going to make us more resilient. So, love that. Would you mind talking a little bit about the process of studying animals medicating in general? Are we typically looking at, you gave the example of chimps in the wild. Is that way that we're discovering this? Or maybe you mentioned traditional Chinese medicine or other traditional medicines of kind of looking back on what's been done, or what's currently like kind of the pathway moving forward for understanding this field?
Yeah, so there's essentially two types of studies, right? One type is the observational studies, and when we discuss the chimpanzees, that's, you observe wild animals, you see them behave in interesting ways, and then it's like almost like forensic evidence, like putting all the pieces into place to see this is what they're doing. The other approach is experimental, and so this, for example, the livestock we talked about, you can do the experiments with sheep or goats or cattle. Way harder to do, say, with chimpanzees or elephants. Harder, also less ethical. But I think this is also why we have so much evidence now for insects, because insects are really easy to use for experiments. A lot of people are not as bothered about doing experiments with insects. So it's much easier to have large numbers, where you have a certain number of caterpillars, you give the disease another group, you don't, and then see how they respond, right? And so that makes it easier to really directly see if they get sick, do they change their behavior in a way that makes them better, because then you can really demonstrate that they're medicating. And that's easier to do with caterpillars and flies and bees and ants than it is with elephants and chimpanzees.
That makes a lot of sense. People are probably, I mean, people love woolly bears, but they're probably a little less attached to woolly bears than chimpanzees.
Yeah. And it's just easier as well. They're also, you can rear them in the lab, you can breed them in the lab. It's way harder, of course. Even if you said it was okay to do it with chimpanzees, to rear hundreds of chimpanzees and then see how many die when you infect them, it's just not an ethical thing to do.
Yeah. I also remember in the book you mentioned something about chimpanzees using some things for maybe recreational or fun purposes.
Yeah.
And this is also a question from a community member. Laura O'Rourke said, I'd love to know if it's true if dolphins use pufferfish to get high. And if it's true, are there any other animals that use plants for recreational use? Also, if they are using it for fun, are there any animals that use plants when they're depressed to boost their mood or even commit suicide?
There's a lot to unpack there.
That's a big question.
Really great question. So first of all, there are a lot of studies, a lot of anecdotes, I should say, of animals using things for recreational use. I didn't talk much about it in my book because, again, I wanted to focus on the things that we have the most evidence for, and that is infectious disease. So, but we do know there are a lot of animals that use, whether it's plants or other animals, that may be purely recreational, or it may have multiple functions. So there are definitely plenty of examples of say, chimpanzees using fermented fruit. You see it with elephants too, and that's actually really dangerous because there are really stories where elephants go for fermented fruits and they get drunk, and they start, they're just like drunk people, except they're way bigger, so really obnoxious and really dangerous. And so that can be really bad for people in the vicinity. So do they use it for fun? Could be. There are some ideas that they use it for nutrition because oftentimes the only available fruit is fermented fruit. And of course, it's a really good source of carbohydrates, and alcohol is really easy to digest to provide sugars for the body. And also the benefit of eating fermented fruit can be that it has killed a lot of pathogen or, disease-causing bacteria and other microorganisms. So that's some idea. Now, there is one example I really love is lemurs and capuchins, and they often use millipedes. And so some millipedes, when they get harassed, they start oozing a lot of toxic liquid, and they do that to protect themselves against predators. But what these primates do is they love ripping them apart and harassing them, and they start rubbing that in their own fur, but also in each other's fur. And they really seem to just having a really good time. Now, we know the toxins also protect against mosquitoes and botflies. So by covering their fur, it works like a repellent, right? But do they do it just for fun and to cement their social relationships? Just like you and I may go to the pub, right, and have a beer, or and maybe just for social, not to medicate.
So is that absorbing through their skin?
They just smear it into their fur, just like we may smear stuff on our skin. And they do the same. They rub it into their fur. So I'd say, it's kind of difficult to really demonstrate an animal is doing something purely for fun or to get intoxicated. But at the same time, it's not unthinkable, right? Because we as humans do a lot of things that are just for fun.
A lot of things.
It's interesting that scientists are kind of on it both ways, right? On the one hand, they say animals aren't as smart as humans, but on the other hand, they say everything they do has to be adaptive and serve a function. And so I always find that very strange. It's very ironic because those two things just don't go together. So I think there's a lot of cases of animals doing things just because it's fun, but it's we're not there yet to fully demonstrate that.
That's fair. Have you heard about this pufferfish and dolphin example?
Yeah, I was just going to get back to that. So I don't know about, I need to look at that one. But we do know other cases, there are some animals that may go for, so because even the idea of some of the magic mushrooms, we think actually came from animals or from humans actually studying the reindeer eating some of the mushrooms that caused this and started seeing them. Same with ayahuasca. Actually, we think that ayahuasca was discovered by shamans and traditional healers looking at jaguars that use it and then become really, open-eyed and really start doing other things. And so
I didn't know that, the history there. I mean, that story's always blown my mind, the way that people discovered ayahuasca, because it's such a complex recipe and concentration of compounds. It's the pharmacology is insane, and the fact that people were able to figure that out just based on understanding plants and how people react to things. It's amazing.
Yeah. Okay. And then to come back to, I think the last part of that question was depression and anxiety. Yes. And so, yes, and this is really a growing field, and it's really interesting because there's actually, there's a lot of people now really looking at that and for use in our companion animals, such as horses, and our pets, such as dogs and cats. And there's some really clear evidence in my mind that animals can use particular plants or even essential oils that calm them down. And there's now actually starting to appear scientific studies to demonstrate this, because a lot of this hasn't been, published in the scientific literature yet, but we're starting to see that. But definitely there is a lot of plants such as valerian really seems to calm down cats. So I think a lot of our animals have anxiety and again, it comes down to choices, right? If they have access to the plants that calm them down, that can be helpful for them. Suicide, I don't know. I'm not aware of any examples of animals purposefully eating something to kill themselves. We'll leave that for another episode. I don't know.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's certainly an interesting question, especially if like an animal is really sick and there's a threat that they bring that sickness into their family group. Like, is there a case where not people, where these animals would vaporize themselves in order to save the rest of their counterparts?
Yeah, so we do know of ants. Ants often do this when they're infected. Some ants will actually remove themselves from the colony to die in isolation. And that takes the infectious organisms away from the colony. There's also a lot of cases where animals may kill each other to prevent the spread of disease. And so again, you look at ants or bees. So in honeybees, there is a behavior called hygienic behavior, where the honeybees will actually detect that a larva or a pupa is sick. They will open the cell in which it's growing and then take it out and dump it outside the colony. And so it's an extreme case of hygiene, right? And
wow.
So they do that. And then there's another one and then there is what's really interesting more recently, that's not really and a recent example in ants is that sometimes the queens eat workers that are infected with a fungus. And so they kill, they eat, and they prevent the spread of disease. So there's definitely examples of killing and some suicide of those ants, but not, as far as I'm aware, by eating something that will kill them.
Gotcha. Okay. That does make sense. So we've been talking a lot about medicating with plants, with, tasting certain plants or these different types of insects or larger animals using plants as medicine. We know most human medicines that come from nature also coming from plant medicine. But do we have other examples of, you mentioned millipedes. Are there other insects, fungi, bacteria? Are there other types of natural products that we've seen animals medicating with?
Yeah, so I will say the best evidence, again, we have right now is plants, because most of the experiments that have been done done with those. So the millipedes are definitely a good example of what looks like the lemurs and the capuchins using this as a way to get rid of mosquitoes or prevent mosquitoes and botflies from biting them. And that's using the toxins produced by animals, in this case, millipedes. There's dolphins. I'm not aware of the dolphins eating the pufferfish, but there was a study a few years ago that shows that dolphins like to rub themselves against sponges and corals. And this was in the Red Sea. And this may be to treat some infections on their skin, because these sponges and corals produce a lot of antimicrobials. We don't quite know yet. So that's something we need more evidence to really see that the dolphins aren't just do it for fun, because it could be fun, or maybe they're relieving itch. So that's something
itch. Yeah, I could see. I could see.
And then there's a lot of examples of animals eating clay, and oftentimes they eat clay to neutralize toxins in their guts. But it also seems that sometimes they're eating particular clay or particular, soil to even maybe supplement their internal flora or their microbiome in their guts to also help with their health.
And so when you said neutralizing, kind of like how we would take like activated charcoal or something to kind of bind up toxins, so they could eat clay or dirt to do similar things.
Yeah, there is even stories. Some people may be aware of elephants in particular parts of Africa that had basically excavated whole caves by eating a lot of clay. And those are elephants that live in areas where they have to eat a lot of very toxic plants. So they're constantly exposed to all these plant toxins, and they eat a lot of clay, most likely to really neutralize these toxins.
That is fascinating. That's really, really cool. So with all of these kind of, I'm going to call them adaptations, dietary changes, with all of these medicinal aspects, do we think that these animals are learning this as a component of evolution, like over time, that survival of the fittest, the ones that learn how to medicate properly, live longer, and therefore it's a component of evolution?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think, and behaviors are, partly learned, partly driven by the genes of the animals. So like any other traits, they can evolve. And I think in some cases, it's the ability to learn that will evolve and get passed on from parents to offspring. In other cases, it's really just the mechanism, the physiological mechanisms in the bodies, like we saw for the woolly bear caterpillars, those taste receptors that respond to these alkaloids and tell the brains, hey, eat more of this. That is really based on that physiology, so that can be selected for. Parasites and pathogens are extremely important selective forces in nature. Very few of us get eaten, but we all get sick, right? And so parasites and pathogens are everywhere, and they infect everything. So you can be an apex predator like a wolf in Yellowstone and still have tons of parasites that can kill you. Right. So no one is safe from parasites and pathogens. And so anything that animals or other organisms can do to evolve tolerance or resistance in some ways is going to be selected for. Right. So, and that doesn't mean we're all going to have everything to protect ourselves, but you think about our immune systems, you think about our skin, you think about enzymes in our guts. There's so many different ways that we protect ourselves against parasites. So behavior is just one of them.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So my kind of background in research is with cannabis as medicine. That's what a lot of what I spend my time researching. And a component of cannabis is you typically light it on fire to initiate it, to be able to get most of the active compounds. Do we know of any animals using cannabis to self-medicate in any way?
I'm digging in my brain right now. That's why.
No, it's okay. I haven't even gone down this rabbit hole, but I would assume at some point some animals.
Yeah, I mean there are definitely caterpillars that eat the plants.
It's a huge pest to the cannabis industry is caterpillars.
Yeah. And so just like, when we think about caterpillars that eat tobacco plants or that eat coffee plants and that that there's all those chemicals in those plants that are protective against diseases. It's well possible. I'm not aware of any examples off the top of my head, but
no worries. And even like deer are another pest in a lot of areas. I know, if I'm growing at home, I'll often have at least like leaves nibbled on, sometimes whole plants nibbled on by deer. But there are as this conversation's been going, they're not selectively looking at that cannabis as a medicine in this case, or at least not to my observation, because they're also munching all my sunflowers and all my zinnias and all my other plants as well, not just the cannabis plant.
Yeah. And again, what we do know is the animals don't smoke it, right?
That would be an interesting find, though.
But it's actually one of my favorite examples in the book is the finches and sparrows in Mexico City that use cigarette butts as medication. And I think this is so intriguing because you have people that smoke, and so we're talking about when they're done with their cigarette, they throw the butt on the ground.
Yeah.
And so you have the filter, and so it turns out these birds bring those filters to their nest and take all the fibers out, put it in the lining of their nest, and that helps them against all sorts of blood-sucking parasites, and it helps their chicks. So there's some closeness to smoking in the animal community.
Oh, that is so fascinating. And it's funny because I think everyone hates the smell of stale cigarettes, and it turns out nature hates the smell of stale cigarettes too. It keeps a lot of things away and works as a deterrent.
Yeah.
Or maybe it's literally the smell and the toxic compounds in cigarettes.
The toxic compounds are definitely important to keeping mites and ticks and lice away. And but again, what I like about that example too is that it's not good for the birds. Smoking is not good for us. It's not good for the birds. So even though it keeps parasites away, it's also doing some damage to the chicks, changing some of their blood cells and things like that. So, it's better for the birds to stick to plants. And, but the butts are so easy to come by. So that's what they're using.
They're certainly everywhere. Absolutely everywhere. As we're wrapping up, I want to hear more about your current research with the mycelium of the fungi and the bees and what you're currently finding with that relationship, because I think pretty much everyone knows we have an issue with pollinators right now, especially with honeybees, and we're trying to, keep the colonies that we have alive. So would love to learn more about your current studies.
Yeah, so in the honeybees, actually, one of the main ways that the honeybees keep themselves and their colonies healthy is by collecting resin from plants and trees that they mix with wax and then make it into propolis. And that's something that we're now really bringing back to the honeybees, because the problem with propolis is in a wild honeybee colony inside a hollow tree, we have a lot of rough surfaces. The bees fill it up with the smooth propolis, and it's great. But the way that we keep bees in the boxes in apiaries means there is nowhere for the propolis to go. So the bees put it at the top where the lid reaches the walls, and then the beekeepers don't like it because it's hard. You have to remove it every time. So people have selected for bees that no longer use it. But you can bring it back by just making grooves in the planks of the.
So propolis is not honey. It's a more like sticky substance that's used to kind of engineer their facility where they're staying, just to make it a more habitable environment.
Right. And people have often looked at it and said it's some kind of cement. And this is really curious because people have used propolis themselves as medicine for thousands of years. If you go to South America, you find it in every corner of every street almost as a tincture or something that you can use for all sorts of infections. But then the idea was we use it as medicine, but the bees use it as cement. It's kind of crazy. But it turns out, no, the bees use it as medicine as well. So it's a cement with medicine built in. And so we can bring that back, which is good. My own research right now, I'm working together with colleagues at the Wageningen University in the Netherlands. And that is really to start really thinking about what kind of fungi are the bees collecting and what are some of the benefits against viral pathogens, against mites and everything. Because we know, like you said earlier, we have focused so much on plants, but we know that fungi are full of medicines, right? And bioactive compounds. You think about penicillin, the first, antibiotic that hit the market is based by a fungus, right? So, and that's why we're really thinking about, okay, what are the bees bringing back to their colony to change their own gut flora? And how is that?
And is that an accidental accumulation of this fungus? Like if they're already going for pollen, are they also picking up some of this fungi?
No, because there is some evidence out there that suggests they really go to where the mycelium is growing, and it's so they go to like rotten trees and stuff to collect it. So it's not an accidental thing. And so then the question is, and we only just started this work, so I don't have any answers yet, but the first step is to really figure out what are they collecting. And then you can start doing these experiments. You give them choices, right? You provide them with bark with or without the fungi and see if they have infections. Do they start collecting more of the fungus? So maybe, in 3.5 years, I'll know more.
Cool. I'll mark my calendar to invite you back on the podcast so you can tell us an update. That's so interesting. I am a huge fan of using fungi as medicine. We forage for a lot of fungi. We use a lot of functional foods like that. And it would make sense for animals to also utilize it. As you said, we know it's incredibly bioactive and incredibly available. Fungi are absolutely everywhere. As we're wrapping up this episode, can you tell us a little more about the book you wrote, Doctors by Nature? Because I thought it was a fascinating read. I had so much fun flipping through that book and reading all the examples that you shared. So can you give any insight to the listeners? And I'm hoping a bunch of them will purchase the book and start reading it themselves if they love this conversation.
Well, thanks so much. Yeah, I loved writing the book. I guess I always wanted to write a book, and I have loved this topic for a long time. And I think it's just such an intriguing topic, and it's a topic that should be interesting to anyone who likes animals or medicine, or there's something for everyone there. So I guess the goal of the book really was to show people how amazing animals are. That's one part of it, and that they can use all these medicines, and then also to show that we have learned from them and we can learn more from them. And this was one of the most surprising things for me writing the book, is the discovery that, yes, we claim that we have known about animals using medicine since the 1980s, but that's just Western science knowing that. And I already mentioned that traditional healers have looked at animals to learn things. And so, traditional healers and shamans have looked at animals for thousands of years. Aspirin, that drug that we buy at the pharmacy, was discovered by bears. When they come out of hibernation, they eat the bark of willow trees to relieve the pain and the sore and the inflammation from being in hibernation for so long. People copied that, and so eventually that was made into the drug aspirin. So I think there's just been so much drug discovery that we're currently unaware of that has happened in the past. And so kind of going back to that, saying, hey, there is still a lot to learn. We can go to the animal kingdom and learn a lot about the medicines that are out there by looking at the other animals, what they're using. And so with that, that love for animals, but also showing the utility of it, then another goal is really to show, hey, this diversity is so important. Nature is so important. Hopefully this is another reason to maintain it, because we really need to do a better job maintaining not just the plants and the fungi, but also the animals that use them.
No, I love that. And I think you did such a good job showing how intelligent all of these different animals are, how important it is to maintain biodiversity, to maintain wild places, to allow animals to listen to their instincts. It's a fantastic read. Obviously, I highly recommend it. I'll put the links in the show notes. And then the last thing, where can people find you? Are you on LinkedIn? Do you make Instagram posts? Like, what are the best ways people can follow your work?
I am on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, I'm on Blue Sky, and I'm on LinkedIn, and I have a lab website as well.
Awesome. Perfect. We'll put all of the links to that in the show notes as well, so that people can follow along with your research. But I want to thank you for taking the time today to come on the show and teach everybody about this amazing field of animals medicating, because it might become your new special interest too. And it was so fun seeing your dogs and just getting to know you a little bit. So really appreciate it.
These guys eat grass, and I talk about that in the book too. Why are they doing that?
Yep, my dog does too, and he vomits it up every single time.
There you go.
Awesome. Thank you so much, and we'll see everyone in a couple weeks. So mad love, and see you soon.